A silent cowboy followed a barefoot child into the woods, didn't expect to find a widow. Waiting with the sun, was setting low behind the hills when the cowboy saw him. Just a flicker at first. A small figure darting through the woods, barefoot, thin as a shadow. His steps were fast but clumsy, the kind of run that came from desperation, not play. The cowboy pulled the reins gently and brought his horse to a stop. He didn't speak. He never did, unless he had to. The boy disappeared between the trees, but something about him, the bare feet, the dirt-streaked face, the way he held his arms tight around his ribs, stirred something the cowboy hadn't felt in years. He swung off the saddle and let the horse wander. Quiet as a ghost, he followed the trail. Leaves crunched underfoot. The wind carried a dry, earthy scent. No birdsong, just silence. A silence that welcomed him like an old friend. It wasn't the first time he had seen children wandering alone in the wild, but this one was different. He looked too young to be running from home, and too scared to be going toward one. The cowboy's boots sank into the forest floor as he walked. He found a small footprint pressed into the mud, the heel shallow, the toes curled inward. Fresh. He kept going. 10 minutes passed, then 15. A flicker of movement again, just up ahead. The boy had stopped. He was standing near a fallen log, breathing hard, one foot lifted off the ground. Blood darkened the soul. He turned his head slightly, as if hearing something behind him, but didn't scream when his eyes met the man's. The cowboy didn't move, neither did the boy. And then, without a word, the child turned and started walking again, slower this time, limping, as if expecting to be followed. So the cowboy did. The deeper they went into the woods, the thicker the air became. Pines towered overhead. The orange light of sunset barely pierced the canopy. A thin trail, almost invisible, appeared underfoot. The boy followed it without hesitation. Eventually, a shape began to form in the distance, a small cabin, old and weathered, almost swallowed by the woods around it. Smoke curled faintly from a crooked chimney. A lantern flickered in the single window, and standing in the doorway, holding a rifle with both hands, was a woman. She was barefoot, too. Her hair was tied back in a tight bun. Her dress, once cream-colored, was stained at the hem and clung to her thin frame. Her eyes, hollow but fierce, fixed on the cowboy the moment he stepped into view. The rifle didn't lower. The boy ran to her and buried his face in her side. She didn't flinch. The cowboy raised his hands slightly. No threat, no words. For a long moment the only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. Then the woman blinked, lowered the rifle, and stepped aside. "You might as well come in," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't used it in days. The cowboy crossed the threshold without a word. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine resin and old sorrow. A cot in the corner held a pile of quilts, and nestled under them, a second child stirred in fevered sleep. The boy climbed up beside his brother and lay down without a sound. The woman lit another lamp and glanced toward the cowboy. "You followed him?" He nodded once. She stared at him for a long time. Her jaw clenched. "I told him never to go far," she muttered. "But he always hears something out there, something I don't." The cowboy looked toward the boy, then back at her. Still no words, just presence. The woman seemed to accept that. She sat down near the fire, as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders again. The rifle stayed close, leaning against her leg. She didn't ask who the man was. She didn't ask why he followed the boy. Maybe she already knew. Outside, the woods grew darker, the wind picked up, and inside, without speaking, the three sat together, the woman, the child, and the silent cowboy, bound by a silence that was louder than any storm. The cabin was small, barely enough space for 2 cots, a wood-burning stove, and a table with 3 mismatched chairs. Everything inside had the faded look of things that had once been useful, now just surviving. Like the woman, like the boy, like the cowboy himself. She handed him a chipped mug of hot water, not tea, just water warmed from the kettle. No point offering more. "We don't have it," she said, setting the kettle back down with a soft clang. He took the mug, nodded once, and sat near the door. He didn't sip, he just held it in his hands like a quiet gesture of peace. The woman crouched by the younger child, brushing a damp strand of hair from his fevered face. "It comes and goes. Some days he barely stirs, other days he talks in his sleep. Names I don't recognize, places we've never been." The cowboy's eyes moved toward the child, then returned to the fire. He said nothing. She stood slowly and leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed tight. "You're not the talkative kind. I remember that." Her voice softened, almost amused, but there was too much weight behind it. Too many nights, waiting for the sound of footsteps outside. Too many mornings, checking traps and hoping for enough food to make soup. Too many hours wondering if the past would find her again. "I saw you once," she said, "in town. You were at the blacksmith's, I think, maybe 6 months ago. I had the baby with me. People were staring, whispering. You looked at me, then turned away." He didn't deny it. She nodded slowly. "Didn't blame you. It's safer to turn away." Outside, the wind rattled the boards. The lantern on the wall flickered. "They said I was cursed," she continued, "that everything I touched rotted. First my husband, then the fire at the mill, then the preacher's son who got sick after coming near my boys. People started crossing the street when they saw me." She paused. Her hand tightened around the table's edge. "One morning I found the words, 'witch,' carved into my door." The cowboy's gaze didn't leave her. His silence wasn't avoidance, it was witness. "I left that night," she whispered. "Took both boys, whatever we could carry, and just walked until the trees swallowed us." The fire cracked, sparks lifted and died. "You want to know why I let you in?" she asked suddenly. "Because my boy came back with you." She turned to him, eyes sharp now. "He doesn't go near anyone. He barely speaks. But tonight he came back, with you, like he knew you'd follow." The cowboy shifted in his chair. The wooden floor creaked under his boots. For a moment, it seemed he might say something, but instead, he set the mug down, stood up, and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the woods stretched in every direction. No path, no fence, just the dark. "I don't need you to stay," she said behind him. "I don't expect you to fix anything. I've stopped expecting anything." He turned finally. His eyes met hers. There was no pity in them, no judgment, only the quiet strength of someone who had carried too many ghosts and never asked to put them down. The boy stirred again in his sleep, coughing softly. The woman walked over and sat by her son, placing a cool cloth on his brow. "If you're thinking of leaving, do it before morning," she said. "Daylight makes people brave, braver than they ought to be." But the cowboy didn't move. He simply returned to his chair and sat. She looked at him for a long while, and then, for the first time, her shoulders eased, just slightly. That night, no one spoke again. The fire burned low. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls. And in the heart of the woods, where no roads reached and no names were spoken, a broken family and a silent man began to share something neither of them had planned. A shelter, a silence, and the beginning of something that just might matter. By morning, the rain had started, slow at first, then steady, a quiet rhythm on the tin roof. The forest smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Inside the cabin the fire was out, and the only sound was the soft breathing of the two boys, still curled beneath the blankets. The cowboy hadn't slept. He sat near the window, watching the tree line. His coat was still damp from the night before, but he didn't move to take it off. He listened, not for voices, but for the kind of movement that didn't belong in the woods. Broken twigs, hooves, breath held too long. The woman was already up. She moved like someone used to hiding sound, barefoot on old wood, lifting pots with practiced hands. She boiled water again and pressed herbs into a small cloth pouch, letting it steep. "He didn't cough last night," she said without turning. Her voice was soft, like it didn't want to disturb the walls. "That's a good sign." The cowboy gave a small nod. She glanced at him, drying her hands on a rag. "Still not talking." He raised one shoulder slightly. Not a shrug. More like a quiet agreement. No, still not talking. The woman gave a thin smile. My husband was like that too. Took him a month to tell me his real name. And another year to tell me why he never wore boots with spurs. The cowboy blinked, unmoved, but his eyes stayed on her. She poured the herbal brew into a tin cup and placed it near the cot, tucking the blanket closer to the younger boy's chin. Her hands lingered for a moment, brushing the child's cheek. He was a kind man, she said, didn't deserve to die the way he did. There it was again, that low tension in her voice, just beneath the calm. Something was always pulling her inward, the burden of staying strong when no one else would. He worked for a ranch outside Dry Creek, she continued, still not facing him. One day he caught the owner beating a group of orphan boys for stealing stale bread. My husband stepped in, didn't raise a fist, just told him to stop. She sat slowly, her arms folding across her chest. 2 days later I found him half buried behind the smokehouse. They said it was a bear. That's what the sheriff wrote in the book. The cowboy didn't look away, didn't interrupt. She met his eyes now. But we both know it wasn't a bear. He nodded once, slow, heavy. A silence settled between them, thick and unspoken. But this silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, the kind that only exists between people who've seen the world's quiet cruelties and kept breathing anyway. She took a long breath. After that, folks turned. Said maybe my husband was asking questions that weren't his to ask. Maybe I was bad luck. The boys were cursed. You know how it goes. The cowboy reached into his coat and pulled out a small flask. He poured a few drops into a second cup, then filled it with hot water from the kettle and set it gently in front of her. The gesture said enough. She stared at the cup, then at him, and for the first time since he'd entered her cabin, something in her face softened. "You're not like them," she whispered. "You hear things even when no one speaks." He looked down briefly, then back to the window. Outside, the rain continued, the kind of steady, cold rain that washed blood from the ground, but never from memory. She sipped the drink and sat beside the window, her knees tucked up to her chest. "I don't know why my boy ran last night. He usually stays close. Maybe he heard something, or maybe he just wanted someone to follow." The cowboy tilted his head slightly. "Maybe," she said, staring into the woods, "he knew you would." That afternoon, the rain eased into mist, blurring the edges of the forest like a memory that refused to stay sharp. The older boy had fallen asleep again, curled into the crook of his fevered brother. Their mother had wrapped them in the same quilt, old, patched and warm in the way only handmade things ever were. The cowboy sat outside now, on the porch that leaned slightly to one side, boots planted in the mud, eyes scanning the tree line. He had made a habit of silence, not as a defense, but as a way of seeing more, of letting the world speak first. Inside, the woman moved with a new stillness, not the kind born of fear, but of readiness. When she joined him on the porch, she didn't bring her rifle, only a stool and a worn flannel shawl, which she wrapped around her shoulders before sitting beside him. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then, without turning to look at him, she asked, "Do you believe in justice?" The question hung in the air like smoke. He didn't answer. She nodded slowly as if expecting that. "I used to," she said, "when I still thought people got what they deserved, good or bad. But then I saw men who did nothing get shot in the back, and men who beat children become elders in the church." She leaned forward, arms on her knees, voice low. "The man who killed my husband still walks free, owns more land now, brags about his clean labor to the sheriff every Sunday after church." She turned to face him. "I know where he lives." The cowboy's eyes flicked to hers, not startled, just listening. "He has 3 men who ride with him. No badges, just guns. They say they're there for protection, but everyone knows it's to keep people quiet." Her hands tightened into fists. "That's why I ran. I knew what would happen if I stayed. They would have made it look like I went mad, or worse, blamed my boys. People don't need facts when they've already chosen who the villain is. The cowboy's jaw tightened ever so slightly. She watched him carefully. "You've seen this before, haven't you?" He gave the faintest nod. She looked back at the woods, voice shaking now. "I don't want revenge. I want peace. But I can't have peace knowing he's still out there, doing the same thing to others." She paused. Her next words came with effort. "I don't need you to fight for me. I just needed someone to know the truth." Silence again. A bird called in the distance, sharp, brief, then gone. The cowboy reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to her without explanation. She unfolded it slowly, a wanted poster, old, crumpled. The ink had begun to fade, but the name was still legible, and so was the face. Younger, heavier, but unmistakably the same man who had driven her into the woods. She stared at it in disbelief. "Where did you get this?" He took a moment before answering. "I used to ride with men who hunted worse." It was the first full sentence he'd spoken. She looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. Not just a quiet cowboy passing through the woods, but someone who had once carried out justice when the law refused to. "You're not just passing through, are you?" she asked. He didn't reply. She folded the paper, hands trembling, and tucked it into her apron. "I won't ask what you're thinking," she said, "but if you stay just one more night, I'd sleep better knowing someone like you was nearby." He stood slowly and stepped off the porch, eyes scanning the thickening fog that was beginning to roll through the trees again. One more night. Maybe that's all it would take. Night came, with the scent of pine smoke and damp earth. Fog clung to the ground like a slow-moving ghost. Inside the cabin, the lantern flickered low, casting long shadows across the floor. The boys slept, tangled together, their breathing uneven but no longer ragged. The woman moved like a candle near its final inch, burning steady but visibly tired. She poured warm broth into a tin cup and brought it to the cowboy, who sat once again by the door, boots planted firm as roots. He accepted it without a word. She sat across from him on the floor, knees pulled close, staring at the fire. The silence stretched out, not uncomfortable, just heavy, like both of them knew what needed to be said, and neither wanted to be the one to break it. "He's not getting better," she said finally, nodding toward the smaller boy. The cowboy didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. "I've done all I can with herbs and prayer," she continued, "but his fever keeps returning. He won't last another week like this. Maybe not another night." Her voice cracked at the edge, but she didn't cry. "There's a woman in town," she said, "a healer, old. Half the people think she's just as cursed as I am, which is how I know she might help." The cowboy's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew the kind, women who lived between respect and suspicion. People went to them in secret, but never spoke their names in daylight. "She has what we need, a tincture, for children who burn from the inside," the woman said. "But I can't go." He nodded. It made sense. Her face was known. Her presence would raise more than whispers. It might draw guns. "I'd ask you to take a horse," she said, "but I don't have one anymore. Sold it to buy flour last winter." The cowboy stood. She blinked. "You'll go?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his coat and rifle. At the doorway, the older boy stirred, not from pain, but from a strange kind of awareness. His eyes opened, glazed with sleep, and locked onto the man. He sat up slowly, hair a mess of sweat and dreams. Then, without being prompted, he whispered, "Don't let her be alone again." The cowboy paused. That voice, thin and trembling, carried more weight than any order from any colonel he'd ever served under. It was a child's plea, but also a warning. A burden passed hand to hand. He gave a single nod. By the time he stepped out, the fog had thickened. Trees stood like silent sentinels. No moon, no stars, just the sound of boots on damp leaves. The path to town was long, and not just in distance. It passed memories, judgment, whispers in the dark. But none of that slowed him, because something in the boy's voice had spoken to a part of him he thought had gone quiet forever. The part that remembered what it meant to stand between danger and the ones who couldn't. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach the edge of town on foot, moving through woods so thick the moon never touched the ground. When the lights of Dry Creek appeared in the distance, faint, flickering behind windows and saloon doors, the cowboy slowed. This town wasn't his, but it remembered him. He stepped onto the main road just as the church bell tolled midnight. Most buildings were shuttered, their porches empty, but light poured from the saloon like warm poison, and laughter rose with it, sharp, too loud for that hour. The kind of laughter that didn't come from joy. He walked past without turning his head. The part-time sheriff dozed on a rocking chair outside the jailhouse, chin tucked to chest, rifle resting upright beside him. A paper cup of coffee had gone cold in his hand. The cowboy kept walking. He headed toward the edge of town, where the older homes leaned against the hillside, where the roads turned from dust to mud and the porch lamps grew dimmer. That's where the healer lived. A woman who asked no questions, whose back room smelled of strange leaves and burnt oil, and whose patients never thanked her out loud. He knocked only once. The door creaked open. An old face peeked out, pale eyes behind thick spectacles, lips pursed like she expected a fight. Then her brows softened. "You're not the usual kind," she muttered, stepping aside. He entered. The inside of her home was cluttered, warm. Herbs hung from beams. Bottles glowed in green glass on crooked shelves. A kettle hissed gently in the corner. He handed her a torn piece of paper, the name of the tincture the widow had whispered. She studied it. "Hard to find," she said. "Harder to give." He opened his coat and placed a coin pouch on the table. It wasn't full, but it was enough. Her fingers hovered over the pouch, hesitating. Then she nodded. "Wait here." She disappeared into a back room. He stayed still, eyes scanning the walls, the jars, the books written in hand-sewn bindings. No one else entered. When she returned, she held a small amber vial wrapped in cloth. 1 drop every few hours. No more. Too much'll stop the heart. He took it and tucked it into a leather pocket inside his coat. At the door, she touched his sleeve, not to stop him, but to speak something gently. "Whoever you're carrying this back to, don't wait too long." He nodded once, but as he stepped back into the muddy street, he felt it. Eyes watching, from shadows, from corners. Dry Creek was awake now. A figure stepped from the saloon porch, tall, broad, drunk but not blind. He squinted at the cowboy, then spat. "Well, look who came back." The cowboy didn't stop. Another man leaned on a hitching post, hat low. "Heard you was following some barefoot kid into the woods. That your new job, babysitting ghosts?" Laughter behind him. Too many boots on wood. He walked on, steady. "You hear about the woman hiding in those trees?" One voice called out. "They say she burned her own man alive. That's why the preacher's boy got sick." He kept walking, eyes forward, hands still. "She's a witch," someone said, "and anyone who protects her'll get the same." That's when he stopped, turned, just enough to meet the man's eyes. The street fell quiet. There was no threat in his posture, no gun drawn, just that cold, still silence, the kind that makes men remember what fear feels like. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. After a beat, he turned back and disappeared into the mist. The trail back to the cabin was quieter than before, not because the woods were empty, but because the cowboy knew he was not alone. The fog had thinned, revealing hoofprints in the mud that hadn't been there earlier. 3 sets, riding slow, keeping distance. He didn't look back. Men who followed didn't want to be seen. Not yet. Instead, he pressed forward, boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. The leather pouch inside his coat felt heavier now, like it held more than medicine. It carried a promise. By the time he reached the clearing, dawn had begun to lift the shadows from the trees. The cabin stood as it had before, hunched under the weight of weather and time, a tired shelter that refused to fall. He knocked once before entering. The widow looked up from beside the boy's cot. The older son was awake, cheeks flushed but eyes clear. The younger still slept, chest rising in slow, steady breaths. She rose quickly. "You have it?" He handed her the wrapped vial. She took it with trembling hands, then looked into his face for the first time since he'd left. Really looked. "You came back." He didn't answer, just watched as she opened the vial and placed a drop under her son's tongue. Her fingers were steady, but her lips moved silently. Maybe a prayer, maybe a name. The boy stirred slightly, his brow relaxing. A small miracle. She exhaled slowly. Relief and fear twisted together. Then, as if catching something in the air, she froze. "You were followed." The cowboy nodded. "How many?" He held up 3 fingers. She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. The rifle leaned near the door. She walked over and picked it up. Not shaking, not afraid, just ready. "They'll come at night," she said. "They always do." He stepped out onto the porch and scanned the tree line. Nothing yet, just birds beginning to call and fog slipping back into the ground. "You can still leave," she said from behind him. "No one would blame you." He turned. His eyes met hers. "No," he said simply. "Just that." She swallowed hard, then nodded. "Then we make ready." They spent the day gathering what they had, reinforcing the door, blocking windows, loading cartridges into a small box. She placed a small knife under each boy's pillow, not as weapons, but as a symbol that they would not be taken helplessly. As the sun began to set, she lit a single lantern and turned it low. "We don't fight to kill," she said, her voice low. "We fight to make them leave." He didn't respond, because he knew men like that didn't leave unless something made them afraid. And fear wasn't something you asked for. It was something you became. The children were tucked in. The vial of medicine sat on the table between them, half full. The fire crackled softly. She stood beside the window, rifle in hand, back straight despite the weight of everything. The cowboy sat near the door, one hand resting on his holster. Outside, the wind had stilled, and in the thickening dark, 3 men waited for a sign. They came after midnight. No words, no whistles, just the sound of hooves in wet grass and boots sinking into the earth. 3 shadows moved through the fog like wolves, not rushing, not careless. Men who had done this before. Men who believed that fear was louder than force. But fear wasn't waiting for them this time. Inside the cabin, the widow stood behind the window, breath shallow, finger resting gently against the rifle's trigger guard. The cowboy sat with his back against the doorframe, hat low, revolver in hand. He didn't need to see them to know where they were. He could feel it in the stillness. Then the first sound, a faint creak on the porch, a man testing a floorboard. The cowboy raised 2 fingers. She nodded. Another step, then another, and then silence again. Until, crack! The front door splintered inward, but it didn't fall. A single shot rang out, not from inside, but from behind the cabin. A diversion. The cowboy didn't move. Seconds later, a body crashed against the back wall. The second man had tried to sneak in through the rear, but the tripwire had done its job. A scream, muffled in the dirt, then a grunt, movement, struggle. The widow swung the back door open. The cowboy rose, stepped outside, and moved like a shadow through the side yard, 1 man down, bleeding but breathing. The second was already retreating behind trees, rifle raised, eyes scanning the dark. He didn't see the cowboy coming. A single strike, clean, silent, dropped him into the wet ferns. The cowboy stood over him, chest rising steady. He didn't fire. He didn't speak. He just stared. Let the man see who had stopped him. Then he turned back, but the third one, the one from the porch, had made it inside. The widow stood between him and the children, rifle aimed, but hands trembling now. He stepped closer, grinning. "I told them," he said, voice like oil, "told them you were cursed, but you just keep crawling back from the fire, don't you?" The boy stirred in the cot. The lantern flickered. The man raised his gun. That's when the door behind him creaked. He turned, and the cowboy was there. No warning, just 1 shot. Then silence. The man dropped without sound. No drama, no glory, just the end of a threat that had taken too long to stop. The widow stared, not in shock, in recognition. She lowered the rifle slowly. Her breath came hard and fast. The cowboy holstered his weapon, stepped to the cot and checked the boys. Still breathing, still safe. Then, wordless, he knelt and began dragging the body out the door. She didn't stop him. Outside, the rain had returned, soft and steady, falling over the clearing like a baptism. By dawn, 3 men lay buried beneath a bed of pine and stone, their guns stripped, their names never spoken again. The fire was rebuilt, the door mended. The vial, half empty, was still working, and inside the cabin, for the first time in many winters, there was no sound of fear, just the quiet of survival. And the man who made it possible, still silent, still watching. The rain had stopped by sunrise. Mist lingered over the clearing like breath that hadn't been exhaled. Inside the cabin, the widow sat by the cot, cradling her youngest son in her arms. His fever had broken. Sweat glistened on his forehead, but his breathing was calm, peaceful. He murmured something in his sleep and gripped her sleeve. She bent her head, overcome. The cowboy stood in the doorway, his frame still, eyes on the trees. He hadn't slept. She looked up at him. There were no words between them, just the weight of what they had endured and the fragile silence that now settled like dust after a storm. Then, softly, she whispered, "He's going to live." The cowboy turned his head slightly. A slow nod, no smile, but something in his face eased, as if a knot had come loose inside him. She brushed her son's damp hair and added, "You saved him." The cowboy's gaze returned to the forest. He didn't respond, because he hadn't done it for thanks. She rose, walking slowly toward him. In her hand, she held the empty vial, glass glinting in the morning light like a relic. "I'll bury this," she said, "so I don't forget what it cost to keep him breathing." He glanced at her hand, then at her eyes. Still no words. She stepped outside, barefoot on the wet ground, and knelt in the garden where the first shoots of spring were beginning to rise. With quiet fingers, she buried the vial beneath a young sunflower sprout. Behind her, the cowboy leaned against the porch post, watching. The older boy came to the door, blanket over his shoulders. "He asked for you," he said softly, pointing back toward the cabin. The cowboy stepped inside, removing his hat. The youngest lay curled under the quilt, eyes barely open. But he saw him. Small fingers reached out weakly, and the cowboy knelt beside the cot. The boy didn't speak. He didn't have to. Their hands met. The child's small, frail one resting in the man's calloused palm. For a long time, that was enough. Then, with barely a breath, the boy whispered, "You came back." The cowboy nodded. He squeezed the boy's hand once, gently, and let it go. The widow stood at the door now, arms crossed loosely. Her face was worn, but calm, like a woman who had stood in the fire and found her way out. "I don't know what you've lost," she said, her voice steady, "but you gave us something I'll never forget." She paused, then added, almost a whisper, "Even heaven must have heard what you did." The cowboy didn't answer, but in the way he stood, the quiet dignity, the gravity in his silence, there was something close to prayer. He picked up his hat and coat, walked to the porch, paused only once, looking back at the cabin, where the boys were safe, and the woman now stood taller than when he arrived. Then he stepped off the porch and walked into the trees. No horse, no trail, just a man returning to the road, carrying nothing but silence and the weight of one promise kept. Seasons passed, spring melted into summer, and the forest around the cabin bloomed in full, thick with green, heavy with life. Birds returned to the trees, deer passed through the clearing without fear, and in the garden, beneath the sunflower patch, something bloomed that hadn't in years, peace. The younger boy ran now, laughed even. His fever never returned. The older one helped his mother stack wood and check snares along the edge of the trail. They spoke in quiet voices, like people learning how to live without flinching. The widow still wore her hair tied tight, but her shoulders no longer curled inward. She sang sometimes, low songs her mother used to hum while sewing. They weren't for the children. They were for the silence, but he never came back, not once, and yet he never truly left. Because every sound in the trees at night, every shape glimpsed through the morning mist, carried the question, was that him? No one in town dared speak of the night 3 men vanished. Rumors stirred, of a woman with a rifle, of boys no longer cursed, of a stranger with no name, and a silence that made other men afraid. Some claimed he was a bounty hunter. Others said he was a ghost, sent by the war to make things right. But those who knew, the ones who had felt that silence settle like a warm blanket on a cold night, they never asked. They just lived, and every once in a while, a lone rider passed through town without speaking, pausing only to water his horse or nod at a child. Then he would disappear into the woods, toward the edge of memory, where things were broken, mended, and never spoken of again, where a barefoot boy once led a man to something more powerful than revenge, where a widow waited, not for rescue, but for someone to believe in her again, and where silence stayed long after footsteps had gone. If this story touched something deep within you, a memory, a hope, or just the quiet reminder that kindness still matters, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might mean more than you know to someone else watching. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, of silent strength, quiet redemption, and unexpected grace, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. There's always another tale worth telling.